What up, gamers? Welcome back to Gamers Bay, and today we're going to take a look at Sega's 1992 classic arcade racing game, Virtua Racing. So this is really cool stuff. I remember when this game first hit arcades back in the early 1990s. I think I was like 12 years old in 1992 when this game first came out. And it was a whole new concept in game development. In fact, Virtua Racing was originally a prototype for testing out 3D-based polygonal graphics technology on Sega's Model System 1 hardware. And the prototype was so successful that Sega said, hey, you know what? What the heck? Let's just go ahead and make this into a fully fledged arcade game. And then we ended up with this, Virtua Racing. You can see it's really blocky, a lot of polygons. And it has a concept that's kind of somewhat similar to games like Atari's Pole Position. It does remind me a bit of that. This was later also ported to a number of consoles. I believe there was a Genesis version and I think 32X, if I'm correct. Those were not really good. They did not play this good. They did not look this great. The sound was not that good. They had pretty choppy graphics. But this was really cool. You know, this was state-of-the-art stuff back in the early 1990s. And then, you know, this series really evolved. Sega came out with games like for the Virtua Fighter series. That was another game series. It was a lot like this. It had a lot of polygons, polygonal-based 3D graphics for its development. And I could really relate to this game too, for the simple fact that they actually portrayed the Bay Bridge in here, which I thought was kind of cool because I actually grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it really didn't surprise me that they included this because back in the early 1990s and even during the 1980s, it was like when new games came out, whether they were console games or arcade games, they were like almost always showcased in California or New York. California was like the epicenter of technology even back then, just like it is today. Today it's mostly computer-based technology. Back then it was, you know, video games when they debuted. A lot of the gaming shows were there. They were in New York. So it really didn't surprise me that they decided to include the Bay Area, the Bay Bridge in here. And so the game is real simple. I mean, there's really not a lot to this, you know. You're just trying to basically beat the clock, you know, pass the checkpoints, beat the clock, pass your opponents. One thing to note about emulating this game, because I'm actually emulating this in MAME, is that it does not hold the position values properly. You know, it seems to hold the timing right for each lap, but the positioning doesn't seem to hold. And there's a few glitches in here in the emulation as well. It does not play exactly the same as it would in the arcade. It's pretty close. But it still plays pretty good. So anyways, yeah, the game it's real simple. There's not a lot to it. Like I said, it reminds me a lot of games like Pole Position. You know, you had your choice between an automatic or manual transmission. I kind of feel that games like this are really hard to play with a manual transmission, between all the braking and turning and you know, hitting the gas. There's also a pit stop in here where you could repair your car. But the problem with the pit stop is that it puts you back like 4 or 5 slots in the race. And it seems like you can never get caught up again once you get back into the race after you leave the pit. And as you can see here, we're at the Bay. We're on the Bay Bridge. There's like a whole bunch of pigeons and stuff that just flew away. So it's really interesting that they brought all that into the game. The sound of this game was actually really good, I thought. I liked some of the music. The only part that sucks about the music, though, is that the tracks are kind of broken. You know, you pass a checkpoint and then the music changes often. And instead of just, you know, holding a single track throughout the entire game or throughout each stage. And the game kind of sets you up to fail. This was a really hard game. This was not easy to play. It was real easy to lose control of the vehicle. Definitely a little bit harder to play in main than it was in the arcades as well. Controls are a little wonky. They're definitely not perfect, but it's playable. I did try to adjust things like, the steering sensitivity, and I really didn't have any luck in that. It just seemed to hold the way they are no matter how I changed them. But yeah, the game pretty much sets you up for failure. It was designed to eat your quarters. It was just really designed to be entertaining. It wasn't really, I don't think they took into I don't think that they took into the concept that, people were playing this to win, I've never actually positioned first except for the first round in this game ever, even when it first came out in arcades way back in the day. But, this stuff was so cool. I'm really surprised that Sega isn't doing anything that's real modern like this, They're not bringing this type of concept back again. Because I could see them coming out with a whole new series of Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, with a even more modern 3D look. They maybe bring back some of this, the polygonal concept. I can really see people buying games like this. So it kind of baffles me that they've never really extended upon this for the last few decades. But in the 90s, yeah, this was like state of the art. There was nothing. Sega really had this down. Look at Capcom System 1 and 2 games. They had great graphics. Capcom System 2 hardware was really good. The graphics were really good, but they didn't have this 3D concept down the way that Sega's AM2 Studios did, which is actually, that's who developed this game. It was developed by Sega's AM2 division for the Model System 1. And the Model 1 hardware really wasn't, a lot of the games really weren't all that graphically appealing. There were some good games on it, but they came out with things like Virtua Racing, and it was like, wow, never seen anything like this before. We were playing, let me remind you, we were playing 8-bit and 16-bit consoles during this time. Back in the early 1990s, Sega Genesis was a thing. It was a really, really popular thing, and then we had the Super Nintendo, and when the Super Nintendo came out, it was like, wow, these graphics are just killer, But back then, back in the early 1990s, and even throughout the entire 1980s and through most of the 90s even, most of the very best of gaming technology was saved exclusively for the arcades. Companies back then, developers and publishers, were known to put their best work in the arcade first, and then they would put the sloppy seconds on your console, and that's what you played, was the sloppy seconds. Home gaming consoles like the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis did not have the capabilities that the arcade hardware did. And it was for good reason. Back then, read-only memory was really expensive. Producing a game that was several hundred megabytes cost a lot of money. And it just wasn't cost effective. It really was to produce games, state-of-the-art 3D games like this for home consoles, because people just couldn't afford it. And even concepts like, if you look back at the original Neo Geo, like SNK's Neo Geo, man, again, the console was like $600 or something. The games were anywhere between $100 and like $350. And, people couldn't afford that. The average consumer didn't have that kind of money. But in the arcades, there was the potential to really earn a profit from this technology, despite its expense. It was very, very expensive to develop these games. It was very, very expensive to publish them. The arcade hardware itself, the cabinets and stuff, were thousands of dollars. They were very expensive. So, you could go into an arcade, though, and you could play these games, and it just blew away anything on a console, if you think like, if you take a look at games like Street Fighter 2, I remember when that first hit arcades, and it was like, wow, you know, that was a Capcom game, and it was like, wow, this is really cool, because if anybody's played the original Street Fighter, it sucked. It was one of the early fighting games back in the 1980s, and they completely revamped the series when they came out with SF2. And when they actually ported that to consoles, to the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, it just wasn't the same. The Super Nintendo was pretty close, but I think it didn't have, I don't know, the graphics weren't perfect, it was pretty close. The Sega Genesis version was kind of grainy, so to speak, but it was still, it played like the arcade version. And then when they came out with games like Virtua Racing, and they ported this over to consoles, it was horrible. You know, the console ports were terrible, they did not play well, and if you really wanted to play the best games back in 1992 when this game came out, you had to go to the arcades. You just weren't going to get this type of experience at the even with the SNK's Neo Geo, you had what, I think this was what, 24-bit, and or is it 24-bit graphics processor, and the core processor was 16-bit, or maybe it was the other way around. SNK really didn't have this type of capability either back then, so this was really a dynamic feat for Sega's AM2 Studios to actually pull off concepts like Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing, you know, for them to actually make this a reality. Here's one of those pit stops, and this is what I hate about this game. You stop to get the pit work, and it seems like once you actually get back on track, you're like 5 slots behind now. You can never get caught up. That's the only part I don't like about the game. The 32X, really broken graphics compared to this. The emulation of MAME, of course, this is the original ROM, and so this is not like a revamped version, and that's what we saw on the Genesis, that's what we saw on the 32X. It was not the original ROM, it was basically a clone of the original ROM. It was completely reprogrammed to make it function with the cheap, junky hardware of the Genesis and of the 32X. The 32X, they wanted to be, you know, arcade capable, and they wanted to be a powerful add-on, you know, to go in line with the Sega CD and the Genesis console, and it was just a concept that never worked out. But you know, I kind of applaud Sega because they were true innovators. They were, you know, they were willing to take a chance to say, hey, you know what, if it doesn't work out, then oh well, let's just try it. They were always trying something new, you know, but it was kind of a monstrosity in a sense. You look at the, you know, here you have the Genesis, the 32X, and the Sega CD have all these different peripherals. They all have to be plugged in separately. They all have to have their own power supply source, and then you know, the Sega CD games were all grainy. They were like just basically cinematic, really grainy movie type cinematic scenes, and the 32X was just really cheap, choppy graphics that just couldn't compare with the arcade or games like this. But they tried. They were basically trying to squeeze the the technology behind the arcade into a home console, because they knew back in the early 90s, they said, hey, you know what, if we can get this technology, if we can produce this cheaper, and we can get this to home consoles, man, people will buy the crap out of this. But they couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. You know, the Model 1 hardware and the Model 2, Model 3 hardware, that stuff was really expensive, man. You know, you're getting up, you know, the cabinets and the ROMs, the read-only memory, and the development process we were just talking about. You know, you could end up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars developing a game. The arcades could spend $8,000 or $10,000 purchasing the hardware, purchasing the cabinet, the hardware, and so forth. It was never a cheap process. But yeah, this felt like a lot like Pole Position. I remember when Pole Position first came out in the arcades. That's one game that does not emulate well. I believe one of the Midway Classics editions on PS2 they had it. Did not play well in there. Nothing beat the arcade versions when it came to the original Pole Position games. And then when they came out with this, it was like, wow, this is like 3D Pole Position. It's like Pole Position all over again, just with, you know, 3D polygonal graphics. Really, really cool stuff. So anyways, this is Virtua Racing. It's been decades and decades and decades, it feels like, since I played this game. I probably played this in the arcades the last time. Might have been 1995 or 1996. So that was a long time ago. It was real hard for me to pick this up again in MAME. And I had to tweak a few things to really get it to play right. We were able to do the capture at 60 frames per second, so that was good. Because I didn't, you know, that way I could get the full integrity of the graphics to show you guys. And I did the original recording at 1600 by 900. I think this is going to get truncated down, probably YouTube for 1280 by 720. But if I stretch it out to 1920 by 1080, it may not look as good. So I figured this was the best route to go. So anyways, many thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest videos. And until next time, take care.